introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. Today I'm going to give an overview of my research, which deals with amphibians' responses to climate change. So you're probably familiar with these aspects of climate change. We know that we're seeing an increase in extreme weather events like droughts and storms. We're also seeing the disappearance of the polar ice caps, leading to rising seas across the rest of the world. And these effects are all having major damaging consequences for ecosystems, but there's a lot of more subtle biological responses to climate change, and these subtle responses are the focus of my research. So the best documented of these subtle responses is shifts in plants and animals' phenologies. Phenology is just the seasonal timing of species life cycle events, or basically when in the year plants and animals undergo major transitions. So for animals, this is the timing of things like metamorphosis, breeding, or migration, and for plants, it could be the timing of flower and fruit production and fall color. And since plants and animals don't keep Google calendars, these events are timed by climate cues, and so as climate changes, the timing of these cues changes. And the importance of these timing shifts becomes apparent when we think about what's at stake for these plants and animals. So considering any of these examples, you can imagine that each individual is going to want to be timing its appearance to match certain conditions and avoid others. For example, you're going to want to match your timing with the presence of allied species, like pollinators if you're a plant, the availability of food, and favorable weather conditions. At the same time, as much as possible, you want to avoid overlap with enemy species like predators or parasites and harsh weather conditions. So shifts in timing throw off this balance, exposing individuals to non-ideal conditions that can lead to decreased survival or weaker individuals. And the goal of my research is to understand what are the patterns and consequences of shifts in breeding timing for natural amphibian communities. I study amphibians because they're in decline globally. Because they're really sensitive to climate change and pollution, they're considered a canary in the coal mine species. So understanding their response to climate change is critically important for protecting other species. So to get at the first part of my question, understanding the patterns of shifts in breeding timing for amphibians, I've made use of this long-term data set of frog calls. So male frogs call when they're breeding, and different species calls sound differently. Here's a couple of my favorites. This is the gray tree frog and the cricket frog. And these are both frogs you're likely to hear in your own backyard at the right time of year. And again, major props to Dan Sines for listening to 18 years of this data. This data set is 18 years old. That's like older than the Houston Texans. And there's 8 ponds represented, and it's covering the 12 most abundant frog and toad species in Texas. So the major results of this data is that species of frogs are calling together more frequently now than they did historically. So typically frogs partition their breeding in time to avoid competition. So one species might call in early June, another late June, and so on. But now we're seeing that frogs are more commonly, multiple species are calling at the same time. And this is likely a result of climate change-driven changes in precipitation patterns. Historically, we would see frequent small rain events, where now it's more common to have these huge flood events, like we saw earlier this week, with interspersed periods of dry. And so since frogs mostly call and breed when it's raining outside, this forces them to cluster their breeding events around these rare rain events. This increases competition among their tadpole offspring, which should result in lower survival for all of the species. Then the second prong of my research is to understand what are the consequences of these shifts. So to do this, I conduct experiments. In these experiments, I create mini ponds in these black tanks, and I collect tadpoles from natural ponds and add them to the tanks in timing regimes that recapitulate the patterns that I saw in the frog calling data. So with these timing manipulations, I'm able to measure how do different types and magnitudes of breeding timing shifts affect the survival and strength of these tadpoles. So in the tanks, the tadpoles grow, eventually emerging as frogs. I collect these frogs, count them, and weigh them. And with this data, I found that we see really huge differences in survival and strength of the frogs from relatively minute changes in timing. So this means that these timing shifts are going to be really damaging for these natural frog populations. we're going to see decreased survival and maybe even local extinctions. So to conclude, in addition to huge storms and rising seas and potential hike in beer prices, here's another reason to fear climate change. Nature's calendar is getting thrown out of whack, and this is going to be really damaging to natural ecosystems. Thank you.